Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 4 of my Witchwood card reveal. The reveal stream was earlier today. 10 new cards were revealed, including a handful of Legendaries with some pretty bonkers effects. So there's a lot to talk about in this video. If you don't have a lot of time, you can skip to the end of the video using the link in the description to see my quick reviews. But if you have a little while to sit back and listen to me talk at great length about each of these cards, then let's go ahead and jump into the detailed reviews. Up first, we have Hagatha the Witch. Of course, the hero card that was teased in the announcement video for the Witchwood has finally been revealed. It is an 8-mana Shaman card, as we knew. It is, in fact, called Hagatha the Witch, as we suspected. Has 5 armor, as do all hero cards, apparently. And the battle cry reads, deal 3 damage to all minions. So this is another one of those just defensive AoE type battle cries that gives you a little bit of time to play your Hagatha. But of course, the really interesting part is the hero power, and it is Bewitch, a passive hero power, of which we've only seen one other one, I think, with Valeera so far. And it reads, after you play a minion, add a random Shaman spell to your hand. So essentially this becomes a card generation engine that turns every card you play into a babbling book. And that's pretty interesting. That's pretty crazy. Because right away you can see in a control matchup where you're looking for resources and you're looking for value, if you're playing a slower deck, suddenly Bewitch makes every card sort of serve double duty. Instead of just being a minion on board, it's also generating an asset in hand. And that's really powerful when you're looking to go long. You can already see that a little bit with a card like Rexar, that enables you to draw a card every single turn, but this does so basically for free. As long as you have minions and resources in your deck, then you've got, of course, spells in hand. Combining that with ideas like Echo, suddenly you can see how one card can turn into, 3 or 4 minions on board with Echo. Could also turn into 4 spells in hand with Hagatha the Witch. So I can already dream up some decks that look like they could support Hagatha the Witch really, really well, because they're just going to generate so much value. Now, the downside for Hagatha, and there's always a downside, guys, is that Shaman spells on average right now have some weaknesses. There are some spells that just don't do much. The classic example is Totemic Might. It's just a totem synergy card. If you're playing Hagatha, you don't have your totem hero power, so it'd be really hard to get Totemic Might value. So there is the risk that a lot of the spells you generate just end up being fairly dead or really hard to use situational Shaman type cards. For instance, Bloodlust is a good spell, but if your deck is slower, more control based, it might be hard to find a time to play Bloodlust to get a lot of value out of it. There are other cards and things like, Farsight that just draws you a card, that could be cool. Volcano is great. There are examples that tend towards both directions. Some are going to be awesome, some are going to be bad. It's that consistency, I think, which is the biggest challenge for Hagatha. Now, it's true we haven't seen all Shaman spells. There are probably going to be a handful of new spells released in the Witchwood. That could help Hagatha's consistency quite a bit. And in fact, there are going to be, 5 additional expansions, while Hagatha the Witch is in standard format. So there's going to be even more spells. And clearly Blizzard is designing with this idea where Shaman's going to have some pretty good spells. We've already seen that with the Rune Spear previously, a card that is terrible because the spells in the pool just aren't very good. Now we've got Hagatha. You're about to see another card right after this one that relies on random Shaman spells. So I have a feeling that Hagatha might not be awesome necessarily right away in the Witchwood, but I think this is one of those cards that does have some fundamental strengths and some fundamental potentials as a control card, just like many other Death Knights, so that as Shaman spells perhaps get designed very intentionally to be better when they're randomly generated, if that's the actual path Blizzard's going to take, then this card could become really good really soon in the next expansion or two. So maybe not necessarily a good Witchwood card, although still possible. Just generating that much value in a control deck is awesome. If there is a control Shaman deck that's viable, Hagatha could certainly be a part of it. So some potential now, but I think a lot of potential in the future. So fundamentally speaking, to me, Hagatha is a strong card. You might not see that represented right away, but eventually I think this card could be played. Now, from a design standpoint, I don't like this at all. I think it's really bad, super RNG heavy design, because if Hagatha does become good, if she does become influential, this hero power is basically just throwing everything up in the air as far as strategy and predictability and readability is concerned. Your opponent will have no idea what spells you got, no idea what to play around. That's a miserable experience for your opponent. And it could be a miserable experience for you too. If you get Totemistic Might 5 times in a row, you're going to be pretty upset as well. So basically, depending on when you draw Hagatha and what spells she gets you, she can have this enormous influence on the game, and I don't think that's good design. So I'm a little disappointed, I guess, by the direction that Hagatha has taken here. I think it's rather bland in some ways. It's like something we've seen before already numerous times. As you guys probably know, I made a ton of Hagatha designs that I thought were more interesting. Bland is okay, though, if it's fair and balanced. Unfortunately, I don't think it's that either. I think it's far too chaotic and too RNG-based. So I think Hagath is a good card, just not necessarily a good card for Hearthstone, if that makes any sense at all. So now let's move on to another Shaman card here. This is the Witch's Apprentice, and it's basically Babbling Book for Shaman. It's a 1-mana 0/1 frog. It's a beast with taunt, so it's definitely exactly what happens when you hex a minion. But it reads Battlecry, add a random Shaman spell to your hand. So here we go yet again, another card that adds a random Shaman spell to your hand. So this is in the vein of Babbling Book. It's in the vein of Jeweled Macaw, honestly, too. That's a sort of a hunter version, not spell-based, of course, but the same idea. A little just tiny 1-mana minion that recycles itself into a new card in hand. And, of course, Babbling Book is a card that has seen play. That's a competitively viable card, but that was a mage card. And mage spells are obviously way better than Shaman spells on average. Mage has some fantastic spells across the board. Shaman, again, has far more situational, difficult-to-use spells. Also, I would say that a 0/1 taunt is slightly worse than a 1/1 that can attack. Yes, situationally, the taunts can be valuable. They could just barely get in the way of something, help to keep you alive, but they don't trade back. They don't apply any sort of trading value pressure at all. So a little bit risky to just throw this down other times. It's not going to contribute to the board in any way at all. And again, the spell just won't be good. So although things like Jeweled Macaw and Babbling Book might have been playable in their respective classes and decks, I don't think Witch's Apprentice is going to make the cut, especially not right now. Maybe, again, if Shaman gets a bajillion great spells in the next 5 expansions, that this card could be finally playable. This consistency could outweigh the risk at some point down the road, in which case you might see Witch's Apprentice pop into a deck here and there. For now, I think this is a pretty below-average card, and frankly, even if they do get some amazing spells, just because there are some really weird spells available to Shaman in the Classic set that are never going away, I think the limit for this one is pretty low. It's not ever going to be a 5-star style card that's in like every Shaman deck or in a defining archetype. It just might eventually see some play. So now let's talk about the new Hunter Legendary minion. This is Houndmaster Shaw. I love that cute little bloodhound there in the front of his artwork. He's kind of halfway scary, but also just so wrinkly and cute. Little droopy face bloodhound. But this is a 4-mana 3/6 minion for Hunter. Not a beast, of course. And its text reads, your other minions have Rush. So Rush, the new keyword, just a reminder in case you forgot, it's basically charge, but the minions can only attack other minions, not the opponent's face. So this is sort of like the cousin to Tundra Rhino. Tundra Rhino, 5-mana 2/5 that gives your other beasts charge. Now the important distinctions there are this is Rush, not charge, and it's other minions, not just beasts. So anything you play gets Rush. Also, there are a lot better stats on Houndmaster Shaw. It's a 3/6 instead of a 2/5 for 1 less mana cost. So as you start to compare those side by side, Houndmaster Shaw has some very distinct advantages. He does a lot of things better. Now, Rush for Hunter, I would argue, is less good than Charge. Of course, Charge is universal. It also gives the minions Rush. They can do both. But Hunter in particular is typically an aggressive class that's looking to do damage, to kill your opponent, and Rush doesn't allow you to do that. So this card would not be used the same way we use Tundra Rhino, which is a a potential way to kill things with Bittertide Hydras and Savannah Highmanes, etc. But I still think Houndmaster Shaw, despite that, has some really interesting interactions and potential, because Hunter is a class that also uses Death Rattles. And in particular, Death Rattles are awesome with Rush, because no matter what the minion is, whether it's a beast or not, if it has Death Rattle, you can instantly play it into the board, it will gain rush and be able to trade into something, hopefully killing itself and triggering that death rattle effect. And of course, death rattle effects do awesome things usually. And that means that the minion that, say, comes out of the death rattle, if a minion were to come out of it, say you charge a Savannah Highmane, for instance, take a great trade, then your 2/2 minions that come out of your Savannah Highmane, guess what? They also have rush. So then you can use them to trade as well. Now, that's the ideal scenario. So like a death rattle hunter deck. I think there are also some ideas you could do with poisonous minions. You know, poisonous minions don't have charge, but if you give them charge, they can become really powerful removal tools. So that's another angle you could use with Houndmaster Shaw. The challenge, of course, as always, is getting a minion like this to stick on the board. Like, you can play this on 4 and hope it lingers around for a couple turns to do something interesting on future turns, like 5 and 6. But even if you don't play it early and preemptively and get it to stick on board, at 4 mana, I do think it's cheap enough that you can combo it out in a single turn with other cards and still accomplish something of value. You can play this for 10 mana with a Savannah Highmane, and hey, that's maybe not so terrible. And it might linger around on the board because your opponent's got so much stuff to deal with. You can combo with a couple cheap minions as well. So because the cost is just low enough and the stats are high enough, 6 health is a lot. That's difficult to remove. 5 attack things do not trade very favorably into Houndmaster Shaw. So I think there's potential to use it in a single turn. I think it's the kind of card that can survive through multiple turns. And frankly, even if it doesn't, if your opponent is forced to trade multiple smaller things into it to respect the potential upside of Houndmaster Shaw, you're probably happy about that anyway, because it's maybe it killed a bunch of small stuff in an aggressive deck because they were really scared of the Houndmaster Shaw value that you're about to get. So I think it's a high friction card in that regard, a card with a lot of upside. It synergizes pretty interestingly with what Hunter wants to do. I don't know that it fits into a class, or an archetype that we've seen for Hunter right now that's successful. It's not. In other words, it's not a card that you'd probably fit in any decks today. But just from a raw stat and effect standpoint, I see a lot of things to like about Houndmaster Shaw. So this is a card that I think you should keep your eye on. So now let's talk about the new Warlock Legendary. This is Glinda Crowskin, a new 6 mana 3/7, and she reads, minions in your hand have Echo. So in a lot of ways, Glinda Crowskin is very, very similar to our previous card, the Houndmaster, because she essentially takes one of the new keywords from Witchwood and just puts it right on the card and gives it to other minions that you play. So just a little more expensive at 6 mana. The stats are very, very similar too. So you can see the line of thinking for Blizzard was quite narrow with these two cards. They are very familiar with one another. But in the way I talked about Houndmaster and why at 4 mana he was really easy to combo with other stuff, that's one of the challenges for Glinda Crowskin. At 6 mana, she's much, much harder to utilize with other cards in a single turn. You can't fit quite as much into your remaining mana, particularly earlier in the game, right? Because she comes down at turn 6, so turn like 7, 8, it's just almost impossible to do anything with Glinda the same turn. Even when you get to turn 10, it's really difficult to play a minion and take advantage of its Echo effect. Now, yes, with something like Kobold Librarian, you could slam Glinda and drop 4 Kobold Librarians to build a neat little board and draw 4 cards. You'd also take a lot of damage to your face, of course. But hey, that's one really quick, obvious, interesting combo for Glinda Crowskin. And frankly, that might be enough to make her good, because drawing 4 cards is really, really cool. But the real value for this card would come if you are able to keep it alive on the board. If it sticks for a turn, then shenanigans are afoot. Then things can go crazy, because suddenly, 2, 3, even 4 mana minions that aren't supposed to get Echo normally, you might be able to really snowball some absurd value into them. I think in the reveal stream, they talked about summoning portal shenanigans. I don't think that's the route. Like, that's too many cards to support this card and pull off some ridiculous combo to make it work. But I mean, just, imagine sticking Glinda Crowskin, and then you have a couple Leroy Jenkins now. You could play 2 Leroys next turn for 12 burst damage plus Glinda. That's pretty neat if she sticks. So maybe this is the kind of card that sets up an interesting combo, or just allows you to run Leroy as a finisher, because that's a neat little trick. So I don't know. That's kind of the combo mindset, the dreaming big thinking, the high roll type stuff that I don't like to put a lot of merit into when I'm reviewing cards, because those things are just typically pretty inconsistent and hard to pull off. but the potential exists. If somebody finds a combo that lines up really perfectly in a deck that supports it, Glinda Crowskin could enable some really cool stuff. I have no doubts about that. The way we see Warlock today and build Warlock today, I don't know that you'd get all that much value from Glinda Crowskin. I'm really having trouble saying her name for some reason. But that's okay. There can be different ways to build Warlock in the future. I want to think about this card long term, and it seems like there are enough things to do with this where it could work. I don't think this is like the best card in the set. I don't think this is going to become class defining immediately, but it's one of those cards you have to keep an eye on, because somewhere down the road, this expansion, 5 expansions from now, we don't know, this thing could set up something really cool and consistent and valuable. Because I do think from a power level standpoint, giving things Echo is really, really strong. It's unpredictable as far as what it might look like. But just cheap cards that have very powerful effects, being able to multiply that can go crazy. Now, I have already seen some people citing that Glinda Crowskin, here we go again, is going to be really good in Zoo. Now, I don't see that. I understand why people are going to that right away, because they're saying, oh, Zoo runs low-cost minions. If they can stick a Glinda Crowskin, then they'll be able to turn those low-cost minions into more low-cost minions, which is what Zoo wants to do. But I think that this card is a bit too passive and too slow for a Zoo game plan. Your Zoo cards, you really want to make a big impact with a max amount of stats per cost right away. And frankly, 6 mana is a weird spot for Zoo anyway. You typically want to run just up to like 5, maybe sometimes 6 drops, but very rarely. Or if you run a 7 or 8 drop, it has to be something really board impactful like Bone Mare used to be in the past. Doom Guards are often the top end, or Fungalmancer sometimes now for Zoo is the top end. And then you might have a Gul'dan at the end, but that's clearly not the same sort of minion-based play. That's a big reload to help you finish a game. But Glinda fits somewhere in the middle there and feels like a tweener, essentially, where she doesn't really do either of those things. And to me, despite the fact that she could occasionally give you some really cool late-game plays, it's not the kind of card you'd want to play on curve on 6 most of the time. It's not something that's good with Life Tap, because Life Tap is reducing the mana availability in any given turn, and you like to Life Tap a lot in Zoo. So even if you could play 4 Flame Imps alongside her the exact same turn, do you want to take 12 damage? Even if you could play some Voidwalkers alongside her, is that a strong enough play? Because the 3/7 herself just isn't that impactful in a Zoo-style environment. So I see less of a potential for Glinda in Zoo, despite the fact that some people are attaching to that pretty quickly. I think if she's going to be played, she has to be in a little bit slower deck that runs low-cost stuff, not a low-cost deck. We'll see if I'm right or wrong. Who knows? Maybe somebody will find a way to make her work in Zoo too. She, again, has a really powerful effect, so the potential is there. There's a lot of upside for Glinda. I'm curious to see how this one unfolds. I'm a little bit torn on her right now, but I think eventually somebody will make her work. So now let's talk about some Druid cards. And up first, I want to talk about Wispering Woods here, a new 4-mana spell for Druid, because they haven't gotten enough 4-mana spells lately. This one reads, summon a 1/1 Wisp for each card in your hand. And both this card and the next card we're going to talk about are clearly trying to establish something I guess we'll probably call Hand Druid, where you benefit from having a hand that's full of cards. And as we've seen lately, Druid can get a handful of cards thanks to things like Nourish and, of course, Ultimate Infestation. So it's not hard to get, 7, 8, 9 cards in hand. And with Whispering Woods, obviously you would only need 7 cards remaining when you played Whispering Woods to get the max value, because there's only 7 spots available on the board. And, 7 1/1s for 4 mana is technically better than other cards we've seen in the past that summon 1/1s. It's better, for instance, than Stand Against Darkness, a card in the meta right now. The problem with something like Whispering Woods, to me, is essentially twofold. There's 2 reasons I think this card won't find any success. Number one is that if you have a lot of cards in hand, that typically means you're playing a much slower style of deck in a slower game, because you haven't been unloading minions onto the board, for instance, which is something that a token Druid would traditionally do. Play out as many minions as possible, curve out really quickly, and usually play on a fairly empty hand. Whispering Woods doesn't work well in an aggressive environment where you're playing a ton of cards. So it's got to work in a slower deck, where you're banking your cards in hand, or you're getting into the late game and you've used Ultimate Infestation, a 10-mana card, to refill, and then maybe you play Whispering Woods. But of course, If you're not playing a ton of 1/1s in an aggressive deck with things like Power of the Wild, or, we've seen Mark of the Lotus previously and Token Druid to buff stuff. If you're not doing it in an aggressive deck, is summoning 7 1/1s any good in a slower deck? And the answer to me is always no. 1/1s are just complete cannon fodder in slower matchups. Like, it's just not going to be impactful enough. There are far too many cheap AoEs. They just don't trade favorably into anything in a slower game when there are big minions. You'd have to run all 7 into something to kill it. You don't necessarily have board space all the time for all these 1/1s. You're not going to want to run buff cards in your deck probably in a slower matchup, because then you're running multiple cards to get, the stats or value of a single bigger card, and that means that kind of waste your card draw in the first place. So this is another essentially tweener card. Like, it feels like it would be better in an aggro deck, almost a living mana reload style thing, but it doesn't support what an aggro deck does as far as the game plan is concerned, because you can't just keep cards in your hand if you're playing in an aggressive style. Maybe you could do some sort of try to swing the board crazy play where you keep a bunch of buff cards in your hand and you play Whispering Woods and you buff them to the high heavens, but that's so slow. You just have to sit forever and ever and ever, and your opponent is doing so much in the meantime that it seems like it'd be impossible to swing quite that hard. So to me, Whispering Woods, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't line up with either of the styles of play that you'd expect it to. It's not good for control because it's too weak. It's not good in aggro because it's too slow, or at least forces you to be too slow. The card inherently isn't slow, but it forces your game plan and your style of play to be too slow to make it work. So I don't really understand how this one's going to make any sense. Now, perhaps they could add some crazy hand Druid card that somehow makes this better, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. This one feels like a bit of a throwaway to me, and in fact, as you'll see with our next card, I think both of these are going to be really challenged and probably just fall pretty far short. So here is the said next Druid card. This is the Witchwood Apple, a new 2-mana spell which adds 3 2/2 Treants to your hand. And apparently those 2/2 Treants are just going to be 2 mana 2/2 Treants. They don't have any sort of special effect. They don't have charge or rust. They're just raw bodies. And that means that you are generating 3 cards for 2 mana. Hey, that sounds awesome. But it's really not, right? Because what good are 2/2 Treants? They're not very good. They just don't do anything. It would cost 6 mana to play all 3 of them, which is terrible compared to something like Doppelgangster, for instance. That's just a miserably awful play compared to the Druid card Force of Nature. That's a miserably awful play. So it's just 1 mana extra and a little bit more flexible technically than those cards, I guess, but ultimately still just not very efficient for the cost. Not to mention that you kind of had to pay a 2 mana penalty to create that opportunity. So it's really like an 8 mana summon 3 2/2s. It's an 8 mana Force of Nature in some ways. So that's really, really tough. Now, the potential, or the design implication of this, the reason it exists is to fill your hand up for our previous card, the Whispering Woods. Like, this is Blizzard's idea, is like, okay, we need to make Whispering Woods work. Let's give them a cheap card that fills their hand with stuff so Whispering Woods becomes stronger. And that's a cool idea in theory, right? That's nifty. But once again, the same challenge that I addressed last time, in that if you're trying to play a deck which can really utilize 1/1s and a swarm style, a faster, more aggressive deck, the very last thing you want to do is spend 2 mana in the early game to passively add some cards to your hand to set up future value, and frankly future value which just isn't all that valuable because I'm still not sold that Whispering Woods really makes all that much sense. So an aggro deck doesn't want to spend turn 2 just drawing cards or generating resources. They want to put stats and value onto the board so they can really get moving. So you're basically taking a pretty big tempo hit here to create resources that are pretty big tempo hits. It's just a really slow, inefficient, miserable feeling sort of play. And you also don't want 2/2 Treants in a control matchup, so I don't really understand it there. To me, Witchwood Apple, it just looks awful. It's supposed to be empowering in archetype, I think, but it's so bad But if you have to run such a bad card to empower your archetype, aren't you off to a terrible start? Aren't you in a miserable place if you're running Witchwood Apple to make Hand Druid a thing? It feels like to me Blizzard kind of knows that Druid's in an okay spot. Historically, they always have solid cards. Now they're losing the Jade package, so maybe Blizzard's like, we need to start creating some sort of new archetype for Druid, and this was their first pass, but I think they know it's maybe not good. Now, again, always could be proven wrong, but if you just look at this card in a vacuum, which I like to do, it doesn't make sense from a tempo standpoint, it doesn't make sense from a value standpoint, it doesn't make sense from an archetype standpoint. So all around, this card just looks like a failure. Now, if there's some super high synergy way to utilize it, sure, that could save it, but I think that is incredibly unlikely, and I think this one is just absolute fodder. So now let's talk about a new Paladin spell. This one's really intriguing. This is Rebuke, a 2-mana spell, and it reads, enemy spells cost 5 more mana next turn. So this is basically Lotheb's effect. The Naxxramas card Lotheb, been out of standard format for a long time. You might not remember it. But it's only a 2-mana spell instead of a 5-mana 5/5 minion. It does the exact same thing otherwise. Now, Lotheb is one of my absolute favorite cards of all time. I think it's a perfectly balanced card. I think it's one of the most strategically rewarding cards in Hearthstone. Lotheb is like the epitome of Hearthstone card design as far as I'm concerned. And it's pretty cool to see that brought back to life a little bit with Rebuke. I have to say, I'm intrigued. They've caught my attention. There's a lot of promise with Rebuke. And I think Paladin right now can use a card like this. If Paladin could run Lotheb right now, they absolutely would be running it, because Paladin's really good at building these boards that are somewhat susceptible to AoE removal. Often they'll get a bunch of little dudes out there, but then the Hellfire just wipes everything out. But if you can get a bunch of dudes out there and then play Rebuke, you can deny your opponent's ability to Hellfire. And you can just buy yourself an extra turn with all of that damage, all of that pressure, and leverage it into just game-winning aggression. So I think Murloc Paladin's probably not going to exist once this card is out, but any sort of really aggressive Paladin deck, as we understand it today, could use this a lot. And, frankly, I think control decks could use a card like Rebuke too, just because sometimes it's nice to know you can set up a combo or deny your opponent's combo. Just having a strategically really valuable card like Rebuke can go a long way towards making good, solid plays. Now, all that said, I clearly think Rebuke's a good card. I think it's a playable card. I do not think it's as good as Lotheb. Some people are saying it's better than Lotheb because it's so much cheaper. But I don't think that's the case, because sometimes Rebuke will feel a bit like a dead draw in an aggro deck. Sometimes if you're just looking for bodies on the board, if you're behind, Rebuke's not going to serve you any purpose. You don't need it unless you're already ahead. It's like a finisher almost. Lotheb was not like that. Lotheb, anytime you drew Lotheb, you were just happy to play a 5/5. Like a 5-mana 5/5 is okay. That adds to the pressure. It might stop your opponent from doing something. That's a bonus, that's great, but sometimes you just needed those stats, and it was fine to play it on curve. It wasn't always just a perfectly strategic card. Sometimes it was just that body you needed to keep moving and keep the pressure on. Rebuke won't allow you to do that, so I think it's, Lotheb is an easy 5-star card, one of the best cards ever. Rebuke is not, to me, one of the best cards ever. It's just really, really good, it's strong. So maybe not a 5-star card. Don't get your hopes up. I think probably going to land on 4 stars for Rebuke. Still a solid card, just not that Lotheb power level, because there is some downside, there is some risk. It might be something you maybe just run 1 of instead of 2 of, for instance, because you don't want to risk drawing it too often. You just want to line it up in those perfect moments. It might not even get run in all aggro decks right away, or might not be worth it. That's a possibility too. But someday, somewhere, this card's going to be played. It's just too good in what it does, too strategic, too sensible, and too powerful. So even if it doesn't make the cut today, or at least the day Witchwood launches, it will eventually be good enough to be played. So up next here, let's talk about a new Priest card. This is Vivid Nightmare, a 3-mana spell. And it reads, choose a friendly minion, summon a copy of it with 1 health remaining. So I guess this is Priest's discount version of a card like Molten Reflection, a 4-mana spell that summons a copy of a minion. So you still get the minion in this case for a 1-mana discount, but it only has 1 health, which sounds like a pretty bad thing, because clearly you want your minions to have more health. But of course, Priest does have some cool ways to heal things, and in fact often benefit from those heals. We've seen that in the past with cards like Injured Blade Master, for instance, with Circle Healing to draw some cards in the early game and get yourself a really big minion. Maybe Vivid Nightmare works in that way, where it's just a card draw engine to help you empower your Northshire Clerics. That's a possibility. You could play a Northshire Cleric, summon a Northshire Cleric, and then Circle Healing to have 2 Northshire Clerics and draw at least 2 cards, and if you have other stuff on board, maybe more. So that's a cool little interaction. Also, there's a lot of combo potential with Vivid Nightmare. You know, if you want to summon an extra Prophet Velen, here's a way to do it. You can get 2 Prophet Velens on board, and you wouldn't have much mana left in that particular turn. But if you got the next turn and you had a couple of Vivid Nightmares, you could summon 3 Prophet Velens and still have the mana for double Mind Blast, for 6 mana out of your Vivid Nightmares and 4 mana out of your double Mind Blast. So sticking a Prophet Velen would suddenly become this game-ending sort of play. You could even just use this with Leroy Jenkins, right? You could play Leroy and just summon a second Leroy, and then you would have 12 damage out of hand for 8 mana. That's not too bad either. So clearly some obvious ways to use this right off the bat. Lots of stuff comes to mind. Now, none of those really seemed all that good to me. Like, those are all really situational or contextual or very resource dependent or multi-card combos. So I don't think Vivid Nightmares is going to unlock any, like, amazing combo right off the bat. I don't think it's going to completely create some new deck where you just kill your opponent in some sneaky way. And frankly, I don't really think this card will be played much right away. I think this is going to be more of a fun, just, you know, shenanigan card than a value piece of the puzzle for Priest. Because it is going to be more combo-oriented. Unless somebody solves it immediately with some really perfect, easy-to-pull-off combo, Vivid Nightmare won't see a lot of play. Another potential I didn't mention for this is Death Rattles, I guess. You could use this in a Quest Priest deck, maybe, to just get some more cheap Death Rattles. And in particular, you don't usually mind if your Death Rattles have low health, because you sometimes want them to die anyway. So that might be another utility for Vivid Nightmare. But again, I don't think that'll actually become a deck right away. So this just feels like one of those cards that's not inherently bad, necessarily. It's just not going to find a home in a deck. It does something cool. It does something okay. It's reasonable for its cost. There are some potential applications for it. It just won't find a meta deck. It's not like a meta card necessarily, in my opinion. Unless, of course, again, some genius out there solves it really quickly, and then we'll see it everywhere and we'll hate it, which is fine too. That's Hearthstone sometimes. But I don't think that's the case. Probably going to land on 2 stars for Vivid Nightmare as a very situational card with a glimmer of hope, a little bit of potential, but won't actually see much play. And then up next, I have some neutral cards. Up first is the Nightmare Amalgam. This is a 3 mana 3/4. So rocking that spider tank stat line. And this is a crazy card. It says, this is an elemental, a mech, a demon, a murloc, a dragon, a beast, a pirate, and a totem. So yes, this counts for each of those synergies. All simultaneously, whatever you need, whatever your deck runs, this thing fits it all, and the artwork is hilarious. If you look closely, you'll see there are some mech and murloc and pirate and elemental aspects there. All of that stuff squeezed into one crazy looking dude. Looks like he has dragon feet and dragon wings and maybe a demon horn and a murloc head. Who knows, right? But clearly a really fun card, a super interesting card, and frankly, I think a playable card. There are so many different tribal decks out there that just need bodies, they need consistency, they need stuff to throw in the deck. The 3 mana 3/4 stat line has historically been solid. Now, it's not going to be a mech card right away. Maybe a second spider tank in mech decks in Wild, sure. But, and probably not a demon card either, I would say. But Murlocs could use it. Dragon consistency, hey, why not? Beasts, you know, there's always a need for Beasts and Hunter. Pirates we've moved away from a little bit probably, but hey, if there's ever a pirate expansion, this guy's coming back in a big way. And then totem synergies too, why not? It's really, really cool. I wonder if they'd ever update this if they added future tribes, but probably not because it's not captured in the artwork. But anyway, it's one of those cards where it's just like, it's got the stat line. Somebody somewhere is going to need a card like this to fill in the gap, to fill the hole in some deck. Maybe it's just Murlocs. Like, Murlocs need bodies. A 3 mana 3/4 Murloc is pretty intriguing, honestly. So maybe this gives Murloc Paladin a second lease on life. I don't really know. I don't see the perfect line for this right away. But I know from a stat standpoint, from a flexibility standpoint, from a tribal standpoint, this has everything it needs to see play. It's not going to feel like the best card in Hearthstone by any means, but hey, it's going to get run eventually. If not, it's going to be a solid arena card regardless. So you're going to see some Nightmare Amalgams out there, which frankly I couldn't be happier about. And then finally, my very last card here is the Rotten Applebaum. This is a new 5-mana 4/5 taunt neutral minion. It also has a death rattle that reads, restore 4 health to your hero. So this feels like a really good, just middle-of-the-road neutral minion. I'm glad cards like this exist in Hearthstone. Once again, I don't think this is ever a meta-defining card. I don't think this is going to be run in every deck. It's not a Sludge Belcher replacement as far as I'm concerned. But it is a nifty little card that somebody might use from time to time, and it's certainly going to show up in a lot of Stonehill Defender pools and get played. Maybe some kind of, Baku Taunt Warrior that people theorizing could run a card like this pretty successfully, because it's just, it's Taunt, which is good. It's a heal, which is good. It's a Death Rattle synergy, which is good. Now, I don't know that it does any of those things well enough to get included in a deck that's focused on one of those aspects, but it does everything okay. It's sort of a jack-of-all-trades, defensive, middle-of-the-road card, which is always really good to have in Hearthstone. I don't think this gets run over things like Tar Creeper ever. I think Tar Creeper is much, much better as an anti-aggro sort of card, because usually if you're trying to stop early aggression, 3 attack is sufficient. That kills most early and aggressive minions on the board. Also, 3 mana is so much faster than 5 mana when you're trying to stabilize. So how a lot of decks will basically toss in Tar Creepers, even just like mid-range or tempo decks. Tempo Rogue used to run Tar Creepers sometimes just to slow down your opponent. You see that sometimes with Serenite Chain Gang too. I think those will hold their place. They would not ever get replaced by a card like Rotten Applebaum. But occasionally the control deck that needs a Taunt synergy or a Death Rattle synergy, or that wild N'Zoth deck that needs some safety when they play N'Zoth, this is the perfect sort of card for that. So it's going to be played here and there, and it's, of course, going to be a pick often as you need that last-ditch effort off your Stonehill defenders. So good, solid, above-average card. Nothing super special here. I don't think this is your saving grace. It's not your new Sludge Belcher, guys. I don't think it's quite that good. Just because Sludge Belcher created so much friction and so much difficulty to push through, this is not that way because it's a single body. Another downside to running a card like this in your deck is that it's pretty susceptible to silence. It doesn't heal you instantly, so you lose both the taunt and the silence aspect, which can be pretty punishing. It's just not going to line up perfectly like it needs to be that go-to Sludge Belcher style card. It's going to fall a little short there, but still be a solid inclusion. I'm glad it exists. It's important for cards like this to be around. It's going to see a little bit of play here and there. I like Rotten Applebaum pretty well. Just don't expect this to be the ultimate anti-aggro card, please. I don't think it's going to do that for you. It's just going to be good, not great. And there you have it, guys. That wraps up part 4 of my reviews here. A lot to say about those cards. Some really cool stuff. Some interesting new implications for the meta. Some really neat combo potential. A lot of those cards, in fact, seem like combo-oriented. So I'm excited to see how these shape up, how these fit into all the different potential Witchwood decks. Some strong cards in this set. Nothing, again, crazy good, I didn't think, but a lot of good cards, a lot of solid, just meaty cards that are going to see some level of play. So that said, let's go ahead and jump into my quick reviews. Hagatha the Witch is a 4-star card. Witch's Apprentice is a 2-star card. Nightmare Amalgam is a 3-star card. Glinda Crowskin is a 3-star card. Vivid Nightmare is a 2-star card. Rebuke is a 4-star card. Whispering Woods is a 2-star card. Witchwood Apple is a 1-star card. Rotten Applebaum is a 3-star card. Houndmaster Shaw is a 4-star card. That's it, folks. That's part 4. 10 crazy new cards. The reveal season has started, so I've got reviews coming pretty much every day for the next 2 weeks. I cannot wait. It's going to be so exciting. So thanks for watching. Of course, share your thoughts and comments below. I'm sure you guys have a lot of great takes on these cards. You're going to find some crazy combos. The lightning is going to melt down my house and my computer, but that's okay because I know that you guys will come up with some really cool and good ideas. So I can't wait to read your comments. But until then, thanks again for watching. And until next time, game on.